Okay, we're going to get started. And if a few more people join us, that's wonderful. So I'm Sarah, and I'm with Protect the Planet, and Protect the Planet is a grassroots volunteer organization that are working to stop the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. And we have been engaged in direct action, probably most famously with our tree sits, and then more recently with our Hug Burnaby Mountain event that we hosted in collaboration with a lot of other environmental groups working towards a similar cause. And I would like to acknowledge that most of us probably are calling in today from the lands of the Coast Salish people. Probably a few different nations are represented by the different people in our Zoom meeting. I personally am on the lands of the Kakite First Nations, and I'm very grateful for the people and for their stewardship of the land. And so today we have Jennifer Nathan joining us to talk about her webinar, which is TMX Lights the Carbon Bomb. Jennifer is a former science teacher and is going to speak to us about how government is complicit in creating this carbon bomb through the Trans Mountain Pipeline. So Jennifer, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thanks everyone for coming. David's going to pop up in a bit, so you'll meet him through this as well. So before I get to our government complicity, whoops, there we go. I just kind of want to talk about what we're up against. So I was back in the classroom in 2014 when I heard, and this is under Harper, so this is when kind of a bit of a war on science. They were shutting down the science and shutting down the climate science research at the time. And I heard Kenneth P. Green from the Fraser Institute on CBC doing a kind of climate denial thing. And I was kind of upset at the CBC, but also upset at him. So I wrote this quick little email saying, I know it's your job to do this denial stuff, but if you were to come into my classroom, what would you say to these young people who have to pay the consequences for this? And he actually wrote me back. So I just want to go quickly, just as kind of an intro of what we're kind of up against in this sense. So sorry, this looks wordy, but he started off by saying that I did not have objectivity. And he said that because I was a science teacher, he was going to help me clarify the issue for me so he could help my students indirectly. Then he mentioned his doctoral degree, that he was an expert reviewer of the IPCC, and he'd also published a textbook. So can people with graduate degrees not represent science clearly? Well, we all remember the doctors that denied the connection between cancer and smoking. Expert reviewer of the IPCC. Anybody can review the IPCC. They don't reject anybody, so that meant nothing. His textbook denies carbon dioxide linked to warmer temperatures, so goes against all the science. He also said, I presume that me following the science leads to the catastrophic view that I think it's highly sensitive to greenhouse gases, because, well, that's what the science says. But he says that it's neutral or modest or manageable. He said I should widen my reading. And the climate models that proved stunningly accurate, that predicted where we would be at this point? He said, if I teach that, it's teaching propaganda. And then he did this lovely paragraph where he said, as for my conscience, it's completely clear. I feel quite good about the work I do to stave off bad public policies that'll hurt Canadian families, depriving them of their hard-earned wealth to no good end, arbitrarily constraining their choices in how to live their lives and depriving them of the quality of life they enjoy. I feel great when I have stopped some bureaucrat. So this is our members of parliament and people working to for the betterment of our society, from ripping off the public with some green energy boondoggle, leaving Canadian families with the extra cash in their pocket to send their kids to a good school. So if they have extra cash in their pocket for a good school, what kind of school are they talking about here? So obviously private schools. Take care of aging grandparents, expand horizons through travel, or do a myriad other things to fulfill their lives. So and then he said, if we don't keep producing fossil fuels, people in Africa will suffer. So the "but Africa" response. So he said this war on fossil fuels that not scientists, but environmental groups are waging, so always ignore the scientists, are actually waging war on the world's poorest and most vulnerable. So this kind of clicked for me that there are groups out there that will never, ever, ever change their minds on fighting this very consequential battle, and that they are trying to stop our politicians and our government from action. So then I want to go from there to, it's like, knowing that, how did we get to where we are? This is a kind of all the different kind of denial tactics that are used. So, what did he use? The climate impacts aren't going to be that bad. He said the policies are harmful, that we want to keep, what is it here? Fossil fuels are cheap. We want to keep using them. The models aren't reliable. So if we had to have a drinking game for each one of these denial things, we would be stunningly drunk all the time. But also found out that Kenneth P. Green, who wrote this letter to me a few years before that, he's American, he was with the American Enterprise Institute. So again, another right-wing Fraser Institute type think tank. They had been looking for poor grad students, and grad students aren't that wealthy, to pay them $10,000 if they would go up against, push back against the IPCC reports. So constant battle. So of course, over all these years of all these COP meetings, emissions have gone up, and we're now, the budget to stay under 1.5 is virtually gone. And we are suffering the consequences, as we all know, from the heat dome. We're just at another mini one lately. So get down to the point here. What levels of oil and gas production in this country are compatible with a 1.5 degree world? So has the federal government done their homework? They've had 7 years to find that out. We've known they've had to do this. Is TMX compatible with those climate targets? So we have a lonely little green check mark that's going to come up in a sec. So the National Energy Board, we just have a few of us here, so I'd love to get your feedback. How many of you are familiar with the National Energy Board hearings or were interveners on TMX? So just raise your hand if you were an intervener or know any interveners in that National Energy Board process for TMX? No? Okay. Okay, so that was, they had hearings for several years on TMX at the beginning. The National Energy Board, you've heard of the National Energy Board? So that is now called the Canada Energy Regulator. So that is supposed to be an arm's length body that decides the levels of oil and gas production in this country. It used to be in Ottawa, where the regulators were. It got moved to Calgary in the 90s, and most of the people quit that were in Ottawa. So there was a direct relationship between oil company executives and the Energy Board. So they went back and forth after that. So there's no question that they are a captured regulator. They are industry controlled. Two people, you might have heard of Robin Allen. She was an economist that was very vocal on TMX. And she was an intervener on this process. And she and some other very well-known people walked away from the process. They said, this is the worst set of hearings we've ever seen. This is not a legitimate process. And they didn't want to legitimize it by being there. So they walked away. Trudeau got elected. He said he was going to fix it, but he didn't. Instead, he commissioned an upstream emissions report and set up a ministerial panel. Now, are anyone familiar with those two things that happened? No? Oh, no, Roger? Okay, so then how about the International Energy Agency? So last year they put out that bombshell report saying no more production. Okay, good, familiar with that. Healthy environment, healthy economy document. Anyone familiar with that? David. So that was an actual kind of communications, our climate plan put out by the Liberal government. So if you go to your member of parliament and say, I have a question about our climate policy, they hand you this big fat document and say, go away and read this. So they didn't read it themselves, really. Canada's Net Zero Climate Accountability Act. This just got passed in Parliament in the fall, last fall. Anyone familiar with that? No. So part of the Climate Accountability Act was setting up the Net Zero Advisory Body. Are you familiar with that? Roger, yeah. Kate, no. Sarah, I can't see you, so I don't know what your knowledge of this stuff is. What about the emissions reduction plan? So part of the Net Zero Climate Accountability Act is producing an emissions reduction plan, which just came out in March. Familiar with that? A little bit. How about Canada's energy future reports? No? So those are documents that, remember I said the energy regulator decides the levels of production in this country? That's where it comes out. So it comes out in these annual reports called Canada's Energy Future. In the Energy Future reports, they have two kind of scenarios, a reference scenario and an evolving scenario. So you're probably not familiar with that, but then they also have parliamentary committee hearings. So our members of parliament, a bunch of them sit on various committees. The Environment Committee is the one that had a hearing for the Net Zero Climate Accountability Act. And then they also had the cap on emissions for oil and gas. Do you remember Trudeau when he went to the Glasgow COP conference and he announced that he's going to put a cap on emissions from oil and gas? Sort of. And then the study on fossil fuel subsidies, which was done by the Environment Committee. The cap was done by the Natural Resources Committee. And then the emissions reduction plan is coming up in the future. Copy of the letter. I'm going to put a link to all these things. You'll see that will come up later. So for sure. Okay, so I have one green check mark. And you probably don't know what that one is for, but I took a look at all of these things. And it's like, which one of these documents or hearings is designed to keep us climate safe? And when you go through all of these, the only one I could check off was the International Energy. It was not a Canadian thing, the IEA report for net zero by 2050. So they looked at what would keep us climate safe. Everything else here is a communications document. It's a lie to pretend that Canada has a climate plan when they do not. So I kind of want to walk through. Now, the reason we're not really familiar, who has time to hear hearings, to read documents? And so that's why they kind of get away with this kind of stuff. So who does it? Well, let's see here. David. So David's on the call here. He's raising his hand. Yeah, I know all this. So yes, David, I've got this picture from a National Observer story. It's like, I know he's got all these documents. He goes through all these reports. I met David at a tar sands healing walk in 2013, and he'd read every sort of legal case, document, hearing, all that stuff. He went to the, made a submission to the ministerial panel. I'll talk about that in a bit later. So the devil is in the details. And that's why I'm really glad you're here. I want to kind of share some of those details and how we can sort of get on board to figure out how to deal with what's happening out there. So can I just start, any questions or anything now? Are you guys all with me? Yeah. Okay, so just how I met David was we met at the tar sands healing walk, and then we both got arrested over TMX, and we did a defense of necessity case. So necessity and that our normal human instincts, whether self-preservation or altruism, overwhelmingly impel disobedience. We say the emissions through this pipeline expansion constitutes a clear and imminent peril. So courts disagreed, wouldn't look at the science, but it meant that all of that information we could then keep using to see whether our government is acting on climate change and whether it's following the science. You really have to look at the sector emissions. So if you look at this, so from 1990 to 2019, the red, oil and gas, is the biggest sector of emissions in Canada and the fastest growing. And you can see there's not a lot of wiggle room in any of the other sectors. The only one that's come down is electricity. And you probably know that's because they shut down coal-fired electricity. So that's the low-hanging fruit. Where are we going to get this 40% emissions reductions in the next 8 years? Where is that going to come from? If we don't bring it down in oil and gas, it's impossible. It's such a huge sector. So most of the oil in Canada comes from the oil sands of Alberta. We are a petrostate. We are that's one of the largest reserves of oil in the world. And I think we're the third largest exporter of oil in the world. way back in 2015, scientists knew that this was a carbon bomb, and they called for a moratorium. They said expansion of oil production from the tar sands is incompatible with halting climate change. This is not new. We've known about this for a very, very long time. So this was quite a few scientists that, many scientists that signed it. So again, can construction of this pipeline be reconciled with our climate change commitments? It's the big, huge question we've had for a very long time. So again, the National Energy Board, or a regulator, had this inquiry about TMX in 2014 and 2015. They had no full powers to call evidence, but all of the climate implications were omitted. The city of Vancouver took them to court to try and get climate to be included in their list of what they looked at, but they lost on a technicality. Stand.Earth successfully argued that for submissions supporting the inclusion of climate. So everyone worked furiously on doing all these submissions, and then they decided, nope, they don't want to look at it. And all lawful avenues at that point to raise questions concerning emissions and climate were effectively closed. So they had no evidence or knowledge about the climate implications of the pipeline that they were looking at. So then they approved the project, of course, without ever discussing emissions or climate. Trudeau commissioned this upstream emissions report. So it made it look like, well, we're going to look at it. Don't worry, we've got this thing coming out. They called it the review of related greenhouse gas emission estimates for the Trans Mountain expansion project. So you don't see upstream emissions in this at all. Upstream, you think that would be at production. That's not what this looked at. All they did was compare shipping by pipeline to shipping by rail. And it was a closed process, so not public. There were no hearings. There was no media access, and only the data provided by the proponent. So who's the proponent? The pipeline company. That's all they looked at, and that's all that was used. And no members of the public had the right to call evidence. So they released their report in November 2016. And it concluded that, of course, there's no incremental increase in emissions, but that's only between pipeline and rail. So they ignored all of the sources. This really told us nothing. But again, good communications document to make it look like, hey, we've got that covered. Then he set up the ministerial panel. So that had here, like, just you go to a hotel and people would talk to this 3-person panel. So they had hearings in Alberta and they had hearings in Vancouver. Again, they had no power to call evidence. They couldn't make findings. They couldn't draw conclusions. Their only mandate was to listen to members of the public with concerns in Alberta and BC. Of course, Alberta said, well, it's going to take time to have an energy transition. We have to continue our share of the market. BC expressed concerns about oil links, impacts on whales and climate. We had academics that spoke on climate failure. There should be no further growth of the oil sands. And then they released their report on November 1st, 2016. Anyone remember this report coming out? I was quite trepidation and nervous when it came out. I was quite excited. What's it going to say? I used to live in the Yukon. Tony Pennicott was one of the panelists. He was the premier up there when I was there, and he's so smart. So I thought they've got to do some way of figuring this out. So they did a rather brilliant thing. They couldn't make recommendations, but they came up with unanswered questions. And you can probably guess what the first unanswered question was. Can construction of a new Trans Mountain pipeline be reconciled with Canada's climate change commitments? So they acknowledged that work had never been done. We don't have the information. We don't know if this is climate safe. You can't go ahead with this until you do that. I was actually quite relieved, and I felt like, well, they can't approve the pipeline because this has never been answered. So this is November 1st, 2016. November 29th, Trudeau got in front of the cameras and announced the approval of TMX and Line 3. And really annoyingly, he said he was satisfied that it's consistent with our commitments in relation to the Paris Agreement. So he said today's decision is an integral part of our plan to uphold the Paris Agreement to reduce emissions while creating jobs and protecting the environment. Completely a lie. We had never done the work to show that it was compatible, that they could reach their agreement. So I was actually quite, that's when I decided, that's my last year of teaching, we're going to have to like really do something. So let's jump ahead a few years. This is, you might be familiar with this. This is a page from the Canada Energy Regulator Energy Futures Report. So this is what they say we're going for our levels of oil production. And this is pipeline capacity for our oil production going up to 2050. This came out in December, not last year, but the year before, so 2020. And so if we follow this line here, they had something called, so this is 2020. This dip is because of the COVID pandemic. And then it starts to pick up again. This black dotted line here is what's called the reference case scenario. So that is the kind of business as usual scenario. And this is what they always say is that demand for oil is always going up. Canada is there to meet it. So they predict this level of increasing production so that by 2050, what are we supposed to be by 2050? Net zero. We're going to have way more production than we do now. They did come up with something they called the evolving scenario. Said if the world acted on climate, possibly demand might go down. So this little pink dotted line is what would happen if the demand was less. Still goes up. So still goes up so that by 2050 more than now. And the interesting thing is they actually say in the document that even the evolving scenario is not enough to meet climate targets. So they don't say what would be, but they say it wouldn't be enough. Now, what's all this blue stuff here? Well, if you look, that's for Keystone XL, TMX, and Enbridge Line 3. So we know Keystone was canceled, reopened, canceled again. Enbridge Line 3 has already been opened. TMX is on the way. All of these are for levels of production beyond what is climate safe and already acknowledged within that document. So again, rather shocking. Why are we building something that'll blow the world past 1.5 degrees? What is net zero? So just a little quick thing. So who came up with this net zero thing in Canada? The first place you saw it was not the environment or natural resources. It was the energy regulator. This page comes from that energy regulator report. So this is what their conceptual illustration of net zero is. So again, a bit shocking. If my students handed this in, I would say, no, this is not acceptable. You got to bring me something legitimate. Because what do you notice? Graphs usually have numbers. This has no numbers. So it just says business as usual has levels of production that keep going up and up and up. Absolute zero brings us down to zero at 2050. So that means zero emissions. Net zero doesn't mean that. It means that by 2050, there'll be some amount of emissions we don't have any number for that we will balance by offsetting or removing emissions. Now, to get absolute zero, we have to start coming down immediately, 2020, 2 years ago, and keep going down, down, down. We're not, we're going up. And we are passing this burden of all the emissions that are above actual zero onto our children and their children in perpetuity, trying to remove them from the atmosphere. Germany, when they tried to do this, kids took them to court and said, you can't burden us with this, untold amount of emissions. And so they were actually told they had to make their absolute emissions aim for as much as possible. So we don't have any absolute emissions requirements in this country. And I'll talk a bit about that later. So does that make sense? Any questions on that? Basically, it's just a communication strategy to say that we'll just keep putting out emissions and we'll figure out how to deal with them later.
There was one question in the chat, Jennifer.
Okay, I haven't checked.
From Roger, which is, what are the forest sector emissions? I think that's from a slide you shared a little earlier where you had, I don't know, it was agriculture and transport.
Way back. Okay, I can go back there. That's a good question, and it's a really interesting one, and another questionable one. So, Roger, you know that they're actually putting in their plan, that go back to that healthy environment, healthy economy plan, that you'll get a certain absorption of carbon by the land. So they count a certain level of absorption. What they don't count is, so they've done this kind of trade-off when you log, they're not counting those emissions that are removed because they say, hey, the wood's not burned or anything, it's still there. So we'll deal with those later. So they're not counted. And then the forest fire emissions aren't counted. So if we put out about 730 million tons annually, anyone want to guess what a bad forest fire year might put out? So all of Canada, every sector 730, what's a bad forest fire year? So I think one of the bad ones we had a few years ago was 230 million tons. So it's a huge amount and we don't count them. So when you start to look at the fact that we don't count, the way that we play with numbers, the atmosphere doesn't care. A forest fire, CO2 is CO2. So it's scary that we're not counting that. So really the only way to prevent the forest fires and all that kind of thing is to stop burning fossil fuels. So really everything you hear out there, if it doesn't involve getting off fossil fuels, not going to help. So is the Canadian government acting on climate change? Is it following the science? Let's get to this 2021. This last year was a big year. So May 17th, so you've heard of this, the IEA, the International Energy Agency, said, okay, we've been telling you for years where energy demand is, and we've also been telling you where the levels need to be climate safe, and everyone ignores that. And they say, we're going to use the demand figures, not the science figures. And so that to increase production. So finally, the IEA, I think, kind of lost it. And they said, okay, I'm telling you right now, you have to stop developing new oil, coal, and gas fields today, so this is last year, or face a dangerous rise in global temperature. There can be no new spending on oil, gas projects. They need to end immediately to avert the climate crisis. So that hit the world like a ton of bricks and really galvanized people. That's pretty, pretty black and white. You either stop or you don't. So clear choices. This is their graph. So by 2050, oil, this is just for oil, has to be down 75% of where we are now. By 2040, it has to be down 50%. We have to start coming down fast and now. The world is kind of trying to level off. These are their stated policies. These are pledges without the policies yet. We have this huge gap we have to meet to get down to where we need to be. So how does Canada fit into that? We're going in the opposite direction. So again, the evolving scenario and the reference case scenario have us increasing way in the opposite of where we need to be. And again, because we're the third largest exporter, this is a very serious thing. So on April 14th last year, Angela Carter, who's been a very outspoken academic on production levels in this country, said that you're not doing the math, we're going to do the math. What is the math if we continue our oil and gas production to 2050 and then count the emissions that we export? So remember I said we export almost all our oil? Not 85% of the emissions from every barrel of oil we produce is burned outside of Canada and we don't count them. So we pretend they don't matter. But we would actually be 16% of the world's remaining carbon budget if we do what we want to do. We would, remember we're supposed to be net zero by 2050, but we'd have some emissions left. Well, just from oil and gas production in this country, we'd still have 200 million tons of CO2. Again, 730 is how many emissions we would have now. We're miles off absolute zero just from oil and gas alone. They said carbon capture and storage won't help Canada meet its climate target. Again, that's the direction that Canada has chosen to go. Let's just increase our production, but we'll try and capture the emissions from production and ignore the 85 to 90% of emissions we export. And then they also did the math to determine that the fossil fuel industries and their associations lobbied government officials 1,224 times more than, I think, 4.5 times per working day over the course of the pandemic. So no time off for them. So in, I think right after that came out, there was a letter that was written by 24 climate scientists, academics, and energy system modelers in this country, urging Trudeau to instruct the Canada Energy Regulator, please model your production amounts to be in line with the science, the thing you've been ignoring for all of these years. You're only modeling a suite of scenarios that imply we're going to ignore our climate targets, that the world's not going to do anything, and Canada's climate policies will lack the ambition and decide to fail for 2050. So on one hand, you have these climate targets we tell people. On the other hand, we choose oil production levels that completely ignore it. So asking the government, please do the math we've been asking you to do for years. So then last summer, they started having hearings with the Environment Committee, so the parliamentary members of parliament on that committee, on this Net Zero Climate Accountability Act. It had 8 days of meetings, and 75 parliamentary, anyone could submit a brief to these. So David and I did, and they got briefs from climate scientists, from Indigenous groups, from health bodies, etc. There were 47 witnesses that spoke to the MPs, but you can't just, anyone can go, you have to get approval. Elizabeth May said, you know, I tried to bring climate scientists, Indigenous people, youth, an advisory panel person from New Zealand who's very successfully set up their advisory panel. None of those witnesses were accepted. So this Climate Accountability Act, you're legally required to give targets, but you're not legally required to meet them. And the NDP sadly nixed every progressive amendment to get that 2025 objective, which really doesn't mean anything. So if you actually, you know, and that's when I first started to watch these committee hearings. And it's really telling to know what our members of parliament are up to, what are they doing, how do they address the witnesses, what questions do they ask, and what responses are they getting. And it was really clear from this that they were designing this Climate Accountability Act to be a communication strategy only. So they said, you know, any amendments for an absolute number of emissions? No, we're not going to do that. This is designed around offsets and carbon capture and that kind of thing. And that's just the way it is. So for me, it was rather disheartening to see our members of parliament really fail us. The NDP, I think Laurel Collins had just had her baby. So Taylor Backrack from Northern BC was the one on the committee. And he accidentally asked this lawyer who had been the climate person under both Conservative and Liberal governments, why has Canada consistently failed in meeting their climate targets? And this lawyer said, well, Canada, would you really want to know? He said, do you really want to know? Canada is a petrostate. Canada exports fossil fuels. Fossil fuels generate an enormous amount of economic activity. As a result, Canada's climate policy has had, in reality, as a main objective, the protection of Canada's oil and gas industry. It's not been truly designed to protect the climate. So that was kind of an oopsie moment where all the MPs were a little bit quiet, and I went back to questioning the other witnesses after that. But and then on Earth Day last year, this very important paper came out. I can send you the links to all this after if you haven't read it. But it was a very moving paper where they were climate scientists that are told, go try and figure this out, go try and figure that out. And then they finally said, you know, this net zero is, this is a dangerous trap. Carbon capture and storage, a dangerous trap. And they felt the time had come to voice their fears and be honest with the wider society. Their net zero policies won't keep warming to within 1.5. They were never intended to. They were and still are driven by a need to protect business as usual, not the climate. So again, our net zero policy is not a science climate policy. Carbon capture and storage, I'm sure you've all heard of that. Who first mentioned it? Was it our environment people? Was it? No, it was industry. So the first time you started hearing carbon capture being talked about was industry groups. And they came up with that Oil Sands Alliance, and they started saying, we want money from government to do it. It's going to cost 75 billion. We want you to do, you know, majority of it. So that whole year of all this happening, so this brings us up to fairly current. Are we acting on climate? Are we following the science? Well, you know, we have that advisory body. We actually have a climate scientist on the advisory body that's part of that net zero thing. So in November of last year, Gilbeau and Wilkinson wrote a letter to the advisory body, because remember, Trudeau said we're going to have this cap on emissions, and they asked the advisory body how to do it. In the letter, they talked about how it's not just an environmental issue, it's a competitive issue. We provide energy to the world, significant economic opportunities, energy sector, continue to prosper, greater opportunities. This whole thing is designed around carbon capture. So it's very clear, they're saying toe the line, We don't want to hear about climate. We want to hear about getting your emissions down intensity-wise. So would they follow that? Well, we'll see in a bit. So then the energy regulator came out with their new report in December. Did they follow the IEA? Did they change that evolving scenario and reference scenario? Nope. The numbers were, I think they came down, David, what, just a titch from the original one, but didn't really budge very much at all. So we are really determined to ignore the science on it. So again, Angela Carter, Catherine Harrison, Mark Jacquard, the very next day saying that our energy regulator is turning a blind eye to global warming. They're ignoring our legally mandated goal. We're never going to meet those goals. It doesn't consider 1.5. So this is December 14th, last December. Just a few days later, December 16th, Wilkinson wrote to the chair of the Canadian Energy Regulator to request that they produce fully modeled net zero scenarios consistent with 1.5 degrees of warming under the Paris Agreement. You have to look specifically at that. Now, what's the problem with that? They asked not the environment employees, not government employees, not an independent government inquiry. This is the energy regulator that's supposed to come up with it. What do we know about them? They're captured and industry-based. They've already approved TMX. You know, they just approved Beta Nord. They're not going to come back and say, oh, oops, me bad. We should cancel those things. So, and it's not a public process. We can't see who the witnesses are. We can't see what their evidence is. It can't be questioned. So this is a very dangerous thing to allow the energy regulator to do. So this is not going to help, I guarantee it. Then at the same time, 400 academics urged Canada to ditch a carbon capture tax credit, which was industry was asking for. And they asked to meet with members of parliament. Remember how many times they were meeting with fossil groups? They would not meet with any of the academics that wanted this discussed. Okay, so then get to this year. So February this year to April, there were 13 days of meetings on the greenhouse gas emissions cap in the oil and gas sector. So these are members of parliament on this committee. They had 11 briefs, 53 witnesses. They included the two co-chairs of the advisory panel, and they were asked specifically, are you going to look at production when you look at this cap? And they said, nope, we will not look at production. It's not in our purview. They were very, very clear. They were going to behave and avoid that question. So I think they've actually come out with their thing that's, there's nothing in it that would help us at all. Mark Jacquard, who's kind of who the Liberals look to say that their climate policy is great. He said, and he's an economist, so he goes, well, we don't have to look at the downstream emissions. We don't have to count them. And he really believes in technological fixes. So we said we can increase production and lower domestic emissions with technological fixes like carbon capture. Now, the one who is the one group that seems to actually sneak in witnesses that will deal with production, surprisingly, is the Bloc. And I think they got Kevin Anderson in there. Has anyone heard of Kevin Anderson? No, he's a climate scientist with Tyndall in Britain, and I'm a huge fan of his. And I was like delirious with excitement when I saw he was going to be a witness. He had just come out about a week before with a paper saying if countries were actually going to be work towards 1.5, then the consequences, like what they have to do is step up completely. And what he looked at is countries that had so oil and gas, there were oil and gas producers, but where it wasn't an enormous part of their GDP. So Saudi Arabia can't say get off oil and gas tomorrow because that's their whole economy. Canada has a really huge role to play globally because it won't kill us if we get off oil and gas. Much as Alberta will protest, it won't impact us as badly as some of those other countries. And so we have an obligation because of, and Kevin Anderson looked at quantitatively, GDP from oil and gas compared to total GDP, et cetera. How do we fit in? So here he is testifying. All of this is online. You can go and watch it. And he said, the carbon budget for the world, for a 50% chance of not going past 1.5, we have to make much more urgent cuts than any government is considering for just a 50-50 chance. We've only got 10 years of current global emissions left, and an equity framing. Different countries with less dependence on their GDP from oil and gas have to act faster. That's very tight constraints on production of oil and gas. Because we have the most intensive oil in the world, really we're the first that should go if we decrease demand. He said for Canada, 75% decrease by 2030, complete phase out by 2034. There's no practical emission space for a 50% chance for any nation, for any new production facility of any kind. So very, very clear. It's a challenging conclusion, but all nations, regardless of income levels or levels of development, if we don't bring it down and eliminate by 2034, he said, and this was quite gripping, he said, then you have to be honest. He looked at the MPs, you've got to be honest with your own children and others suffering from climate impacts, knowing you have willingly chosen to inflict this on them. If you are unprepared to meet the targets, prepare to meet commitments for 3 or 4 degrees and the devastating impacts it will entail. So our choice here will say a lot about the sort of society we are and the type of leadership we have. And then a Liberal asked him, oh, saying we haven't shown any meaningful leadership, that's a little harsh. So we said, you're really saying that Canada can't meet the 1.5 if we don't stop oil and gas production? And Kevin Anderson says, simply say what the physics tells us. For all wealthy, high emitting countries, 75 reduction by 2030 is not personal. It's just where the math is. You've done nothing but go up. Not all countries in the world, but Canada has gone up 27% in the last however many decades. So the Liberal MP said, you mean no further project should be approved? All should be shut down? And Kevin Anderson said, if Canada were to succeed for 1.5, it must close all production by 2034. Well, what will it do to our economy, the MP said. And I think Kevin Anderson was going to say it won't impact as much as others, but he was told he didn't have time to answer. Charlie Angus, who was the only NDP on the committee, said, what about carbon capture? Can that work? Said no. In the end, climate doesn't care about short-term politics, Machiavellian policies, and accountancy scams. It only cares about CO2 molecules, and that's the science. Asked about carbon capture again, it'll delay by 2030, it's only going to capture 0.1% of the carbon dioxide we emit. That's globally. So if we're serious about carbon budgets and what the physics tells us, we don't have time for carbon capture. And then after that, they had the fossil fuel subsidy hearing. So that was the Environment Committee, 7 days of meetings, 19 briefs, 37 witnesses. And David was actually got to be a witness here. Highly encourage you to watch him. He went up against this Dr. Heather Exner-Perot with the Macdonald Laurier. This is like the Fraser Institute. So she was like, carbon dioxide is wonderful. She actually called it the miracle molecule. And of course, the Conservatives all directed their questions to her. And David does, again, a kind of Kevin Anderson truth telling about, we can't be looking at what's a subsidy or not. We just have to get production down. Also, Julia Levin with the Environmental Defense was really good. She was also on that day. So these hearings are really quite gripping, but they go on with barely anybody watching. They're not in the news. And then the reports come out and they, again, don't represent what the science actually tells us we need to do. Of course, at the same time, the war in Ukraine broke out. Again, all of those front groups thought this was a brilliant excuse to say our stuff is needed. We will help the world if we increase production massively. Of course, we won't be able to get like Bay du Nord for 2028. So again, not true. So this emissions cap thing, oh, well, we have to come out with that emissions reduction plan, but we don't really know how to do the cap. So we're not going to do anything on that till next year. So we're not going to say how we're going to do it because we're still consulting. So again, all of these things are always kicking the can down the road and we never get math, numbers, or quantitative stuff. And then the emissions reduction plan came out in March this year. And oh, shocker, this is our climate plan, right? This is what environment groups fought so hard to get, that Climate Accountability Act and an emissions reduction plan. It finally came out and it's got increased oil production. Now take a guess, does it follow the evolving scenario or the reference case scenario numbers? Which one? Reference case. Follows the reference case. And then Chalbault actually said, after it was released, and shockingly, this was like the day the IPCC report came out with its kind of shocking evidence and where we have to stop production. So Chalbault actually said with a straight face, The plan we presented last week was based on the Canadian Energy Regulator projections that oil and gas production would increase between now and 2030. Minister Wilkinson, who's responsible for the Canada Energy Regulator, asked them for new scenarios in terms of production and demand for fossil fuels and different forms of energy, consistent with 1.5. But we don't have those scenarios from the Energy Regulator. So we had to use the last ones that were available, which show an increased production between now and 2030. So we've been asking for that math. The scientists have been demanding the math. They called for a moratorium in 2015 and to say, show the math. And then we get just a few months ago saying we don't have the math, so we're going by the Canada Energy Regulator numbers and the reference case ones. It's horrifying. And then if you read the emissions reduction plan, which of course David did, and I went through a little faster than he did, just looking for highlights, but page 53 had this little shocking line. The government will work closely with provinces and sectors to manage competitiveness challenges, remain attuned to evolving energy security. That always means keep the oil up. Maximize opportunities for ongoing investment. That means keep the oil up. Minimize risk of carbon leakage. Have you heard of that term, carbon leakage, you guys? Do you know what that means? So that's the famous, if we don't do it, somebody else will. So if we come down on our oil production, well, everyone else is just going to bump theirs up. So we can't do that. So, yeah, so there's no science, there's no research. I think it goes the opposite. Like, you know, we'll say, well, we're going to ship out our liquefied natural gas and it'll stop coal and we'll save the world. We're there to save the world. Well, what if it stops renewables? So there's no evidence it's going to replace coal. So this carbon leakage thing is just another argument to keep increasing production, to keep production up. Anyway, so this is in the emissions reduction plan. The intent, and then this is the shocking one. The intent of the cap is not to bring reductions in production that aren't driven by declines in global demand. So our climate plan has no climate plan. It's like, we'll see if the rest of the world does something and then maybe we'll have to do something. But if not, let's go. Let's increase production as much as we can. And then mechanisms like the carbon capture investment tax credit will support decarbonization. So in other words, we'll hope like crazy technology that couldn't be built and hasn't proven to work and hasn't been shown at scale, we'll figure it out later. So again, just kicking the can down the road. And then of course, a few days later, they approved, this is such a hellish week, they approved Bay de Nord, and then they approved the carbon in the federal budget. So it's been a hell year. And they've proven with every one of these things that we do not have a we don't have a climate plan. In fact, it's the opposite. But I'm not sure how much Canadians are aware of this. You guys are an active anti-TMX group. How are you feeling right now about what we've just kind of talked about? So can I get some feedback from you guys? Anyone?
It's demoralizing and overwhelming, Jennifer. Thank you for sharing, but I can say that I'm just holding my breath. What's next? What are you bringing up next?
It's like, that's why I'm so glad you're here, because I go through this like unbelievable. I can't believe I'm hearing this, but I want to be able to share with people, because I think if you know the nuts and bolts of what's going on here, that's easier to fight. We can figure out how to deal with it. You know, just signing another petition, I'm afraid the environmental groups all came out and said, look, we have an emissions reduction plan. Yay, look, we have an advisory body, but they're not coming out and saying they're not doing anything. This is not helping. So there are a couple of ideas I've got. Oh, just meanwhile, we've got a national paper that every single day communicates how we have to keep going on with oil. Rex Murphy, they're nuts. I mean, they're sort of crazy, but they seem to get a lot of airplay. Remember I told you David was up against that McDonald Laurier person? She got an article in this paper right after that hearing. Not David though. This is in the last week. There was an article for Barry Cooper and another one by Tammy Namath. If you've been following along, these two were paid tens of thousands of dollars to do submissions to Alberta's. Remember they looked into foreign funded oil people, us, and all of the big bucks we're getting from outside the States. So these two handed in these reports that were fake science, like my students couldn't get away with this. Yet they get articles in the paper. So it's kind of shocking how, that's why I started off with that letter from Kenneth Green, because that kind of the big lie like they have in the States, it's like if everyone believed Trump's big lie, would it be just, okay, well, we'll let Trump have another presidency because we don't know how to fight the lie. Well, in Canada, we seem to just kind of go, well, okay, let's just forget a climate plan because there's so much opposition out there of fake stuff. So this is all really, really bad fake stuff. So meanwhile, Damon Matthews, a Canadian climate scientist, just came out last week saying we're not going to make 1.5, and the primary barriers to achievement are not geophysical, but rather reflect inertia in our political and technological systems. So our political system is paralyzed by these tiny minority of crazy voices. We're not compatible with a 1.5 degree world. They have not done their homework. They've avoided it for 7 years. It is not compatible. But the Environment Committee is doing a review of the 2030 emissions reduction plan coming up. So they haven't scheduled any hearings yet, but it'll be coming up. Remember, again, anyone can make a submission. So what can we do? We can demand that there be an independent public inquiry into the levels of oil, the thing we've been asking for all these years, that they actually do it and they don't let the energy regulator do it, that it's dangerous for the energy regulator to be doing this math. So we should have an independent public inquiry. We can make a submission to the Environment Committee to do that. We can ask our members of parliament. So again, Sarah, if you're in New West, we've got Peter Julian. He came out with like a transition thing, but he doesn't mention the oil and gas sector. So the NDP are terrified of taking leadership role. They're just kind of riding under the radar. So they worry about our teeth and things like that, but they won't come out. And the partnership weakens their ability to hold the Liberals accountable. So we really have to take it to our Liberals and the NDP and call them out with very specific questions. If you please email me if you have any questions or want to do this, and go to gooderandnathan.com. So again, we've got this quantitative information there. So what questions can you bring to your MPs? What are the problems with that emissions reduction plan? Takes a bit of reading, but it's really gripping and it kind of clarifies what I've been talking about here. So yeah, so that's basically kind of it. But I'd love to hear from you and any questions or discussion you have. Yes, so unmute and talk to me. So David is the one I've been working on in all of this. So David, do you have any like feedback or comments?
Well, thank you, Jennifer. That was a very helpful walk through what's been a horrendous 18 months, the past 18 months. It's been just one thing after another. I think in many ways that the key thing that happened last year in May, as you pointed out, in 2021, the IEA came out with this extraordinary report on what must be done about oil production. Mm-hmm. And it's absolute, nobody's disagreeing with that. There's no dissent from that, serious dissent. Leave apart these clowns like Green. That has a 25% reduction of global oil use by 2030 production, and a 50% cut by 2040. That was an extraordinary development. It really upended everything. Now, what's interesting about one detail, because we could go on all night about this horrendous story of the last year, the emissions reduction plan, which came out on March 29, which is our new emissions reduction plan to 2030, it actually cites the IEA net zero report. It mentions it twice but what it mentions is what that report said the reduction must be by 2050. So it quotes the IEA report saying we must have a 75% reduction of oil consumption by 2050. But Canada's new emissions reduction plan omits completely from its report any mention of what the IEA said must be done by 2030, 2040. I mean, it really is a kind of fraud. That would be a criminal act of deceit if that was a commercial document. You can't give the good part and not mention the bad part. So that to me is that was a huge thing that the IEA did. And it also is very telling that our emission reduction plan is silent about what we should be doing by 2030 and 2040, because it's completely incompatible with what the government's put in its ERP that we're going to do by 2030. We're going to go up. So
well, I think that conflict between, like, that we're delaying and delaying and delaying the inevitable, which is the fact that we are way off track.
Now, if I could just add one more thing, I think it would be very exciting to do together a submission to the next environmental committee, to do a submission from the Stop TMX group, or however we put it together. And it would address, because there'll be lots of submissions dealing with different angles, but go right after this central point that we always say that the flaw in the new emission reduction plan is that it incorporates as part of our plan this increase in oil production, but that completely contradicts what all the science is. And ask this committee to address that, if you will, that fundamental flaw in the plan, because that's what their function is. It's to review the plan and comment on that. And then as part of that, your suggestion is that we invite the committee to call on the government to set up an independent inquiry. So anyway, a great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Issues.
Yeah. So Sarah, if there's any interest in your group, we could definitely help with that. So I'm just looking, Omri's got a question, two main questions. Have there been attempts to popularize the information in a form of pamphlet or short video? I did do one, Omri, for Climate Reality Canada on questions to ask MPs, which came out in August last year. So there's a bunch of things that have happened since then. But and then the last one, in your opinion, what is the particular, but yes, you're right. I want to get that information out there. So if there's any suggestions or ideas you have on how we can get this, if you think it's valuable, what we've talked about tonight, how can we get that out there? So I've talked to David about, well, we should try like a podcast or do a video or something. So we're kind of thinking about that. And then the other question is, in my opinion, what is the particular reason the NDP, the mainstream environment, and the mainstream environmental NGOs and unions are not willing to take on this issue? Actually, one of the people that presented at I think the emissions cap was the union person for the biggest union in Alberta. Wow, he is great to listen to because he is absolutely clear they want to transition. So when you start saying the science says we need to transition, the workers want to transition, why are they increasing production? Who is it for? So, and then what's the other big union I think has come out against production, increasing production as well? The teachers union, which I'm a part of, they've also taken huge stands on, and I think even our pension money getting off in the oil and gas. So, you know, universities, pension funds, unions, I think it's a misconception that oil worker, you know, there's iron and ore, I think. What's the name of the group of, there's a union one where they're definitely trying to promote transition. So there isn't a huge push to keep production up. Workers want to transition. So, you know, if you've ever been to the oil sands, we went there for that healing walk, and it is, you're breathing brown air, can't really describe it, brown air all the time. They fire cannons every few seconds to keep the birds off the tailings ponds because they die if they land on it. Like, you know, there's got to be better jobs than those kinds of ones. Very unhealthy.
Sorry, I just wanted to clarify the question for a second. I guess the group is called Iron and Earth.
Thank you.
That helps to bring people who are working in the tar sands, other occupations. But I guess I'm thinking of like Unifor or QP.
Unifor is,
in this country have not had particularly been, they haven't particularly been outspoken. Neither, you know, they've got this agreement with the Liberals, the NDP federally, for confidence and supply, and they didn't make that one of their conditions at all, as you kind of alluded to. And then when you look at the mainstream environmental NGOs, I think you also alluded to that. And I guess I'm just wondering I don't know, maybe that's not your expertise, but like what your analysis is of why these groups aren't particularly speaking out. Is it just that they see consequences and no potential benefits for it?
I don't know. I think that, you know, I think there's not enough kind of education on the issues that people like, you know, I see with fellow teachers are reluctant to talk about climate because it gets so politicized. They think it's political when it's really purely science. I taught this for years. I never had a question with whether I was being political or not, because the science always supports the arguments for getting off production, obviously. But because these groups have kind of tried to muddy the waters all the time and have such a strong voice, a small minority of these right-wing groups, I think it has silenced a lot of people. I really don't know. The NDP, I'm so horrified that they won't take leadership on this. I don't know why. You think that would be an easy ask, but we have right now no federal party that is, you know, so we have a country that's not taking action, and we don't have a political party pushing for action.
With the exception of the Bloc.
With the exception of the Bloc, they're the only ones who stand up in the House of Commons and bring up production issues. But you know, I've asked Peter Julian to bring these questions to the House all the time, to educate his constituency, but it doesn't happen. I should mention, I didn't get a chance to mention, have you heard the talking points the Liberals use? So we were involved in quite a few of the debates in the last election, and they have these interesting talking points. Oh, I care so deeply about climate. It's for the children. It's fine doing this, but oil's not going away overnight. And you just need a little imagination. It doesn't always have to be consumed as a fuel. So Ken Hardy said we could 3D print. We could print 3D houses from oil. And that's where it could go instead of being combusted. And then when a Liberal MP just stood up in the House a few weeks ago and said, she was asked directly about production from Elizabeth May. And she said, you know, I was getting my bicycle oil and I realized we still need oil. So you're talking about increasing production, like 1 million barrels a day. And I mean, that's a lot of bicycle oil.
Bicycle chain lubricant. Yeah.
Bicycle chain lubricant, yeah. So these talking points are very easy to dismantle. It's almost like I was thinking we should come up with some kind of like, you know, response to all of these things because, yeah. So sorry, Renee, the carbon emissions, oops.
I'm a union member as well. I was going to speak to the union part in particular, and having attended many meetings, I found that their focus is jobs. And if they understand that there's not going to be a job in the future, they will start to think differently.
Yes.
Yeah.
Also, the other thing is, I think one more comment on the NDP. I suspect that they don't have a plan themselves. And if you don't have a plan yourself, how are you going to creatively tell someone else their plan is not good enough, it's not going to work?
No excuse for that, though. This is the most pressing issue of our day. They have to come up with a bloody plan. Like that's, you know.
Well, there's no excuse. I came up with a plan myself. It's currently being edited, and I will gladly share with you all. But if you look around the world, a lot of those other jurisdictions have plans now. As you so point out, Germany being one of the forefront people. They have a strong coal lobby, so they have a bit of a problem there, but that will be overcome. The US is far ahead of us. They have a plan.
Yeah, but they have a lot of obfuscation there as well. Kate asked about banning fossil fuel advertising. So Kate, you know about Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. They've done wonderful work with trying to get fossil fuel curriculum out of the schools. And they're talking about banning oil and gas advertising, especially that would be cars as well. So that would be a wonderful thing. Look them up, Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. And they've got a campaign on that going on right now. So
yeah, so Jennifer, my question was mostly about banning oil and gas money from political
Yes.
funding political.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I do know Cape people
Okay,
and Lori Anderson,
Yeah.
the ER physician who, as a mom, started this campaign. Yeah, I'm very familiar about that. But the idea is that we are going forward with very small steps. I was thinking if we have to go big and ban this money from politics at all. So I'm not very versed about this, what money is allowed in political field in Canada or not. But this is something that could be a target. I don't know your thoughts.
Yeah, really, I don't know a lot about why the lobbyists are so successful. I don't know what hold they hold over politicians. If you remember, Glenn Clark in BC kind of gave everything up over a deck. So that's the story. He got sort of scratch my back, scratch your back over a deck being built on his house. So that brought him down politically. So, you know, sometimes really weird things they'll sell out for, I don't know. So I don't know if it's future board positions or direct money. I don't honestly know. But they seem to wield far more power than, they've created a very stuck, paralyzed system in this country. I don't know. Does anyone know sort of what the funding of politicians is? Like why they bend to the lobbyists so much? I think they're kind of told that, like in the States, if a jurisdiction tried to ban, say, fossil fuels, then they would be told that they couldn't get any contracts from any, like they would sort of be blackmailed against doing. So they would actually, there's kind of weird manipulations that would go on there. Here, I don't know why. We're just told that it provides all these jobs, that provides all this GDP or money to our economy. So, sorry, just looking at the other questions here. Yeah, how it's going to affect every jurisdiction, I'm not sure. Sorry, does anyone have any questions they want to ask out? Or does anyone have any answers for why our politicians aren't moving on this? Silence.
I'll take a run at that one on the climate breakdown effect, Kitsilano. It's going to be disastrous. You're going to have a heat dome. You're going to have hot summers. You're going to have crazy weather and winters. You're going to have spring that lasts from February into July. The weather will be chaotic rather than predictable. We're going to have massive problems with our
Roger, you're muted yourself.
how it's going to affect Kitsilano. How much of what I was saying was lost? All of it?
Most of it, we just lost the last few seconds there.
Oh, okay. Our transportation systems are not 100% reliable and resilient. We're going to lose our rail. We're going to lose our roads. We'll have a massive problem getting food, both to grow and to import, because the places we presently get food from are going to be in a worse situation than we are. They're going to be too hot and no water. These are just the beginning. We will have ice storms in winter that are going to bring down our power lines. We're going to have reservoirs that dry out, so our electricity that has been reliable will not be. Our forests will not be sequestering carbon because we're cutting them or flooding them. It just goes on and on. It's a nightmare. It's like what you went through, Jennifer, with your absolutely excellent repertoire and references that you had there, one after another. But what we're doing is we're not going historically, we're going into the future. Historically, we can see what a disaster it's been. In the future, it's going to be even worse. Thank you.
Thanks, Roger. One of the things I thought I'm not going to keep teaching because I've always been a hiker and I wanted to go see all these beautiful national parks before climate impacts hit. So I saw the redwoods just before they burned. I saw the sequoias and they had to be irrigated or they would die. They've been there for thousands of years, but they were drying up and couldn't survive without irrigation. We saw Lake Mead, which is now so dangerously low that bodies are popping up that were buried there from sort of gangster fights decades ago. But that's not actually, Powell River is so low that it's going to impact water and power for millions of people. So we're starting to see the consequences everywhere. And I know like our beautiful Stanley Park, the water is going to, sea level rise is going to create huge problems for that whole area. So, you know, when going back to Kenneth P. Green, you know, we want to keep dollars in pockets. Well, if we don't act on climate, the cost is going to be devastating, but also the ecological loss and the impact on species. So it's really sort of the best thing for we can do for us and for ecosystems and for the future is to pare down fossil fuels. So it's really simple, and all of the excuses and communication strategies preventing that is going the wrong way. So how are we doing, Sarah? We're probably past time here.
I don't think we actually like said an end time per se.
Okay. I really appreciate everyone for coming, and I really want your feedback on, like, you know, is this valuable information to get out? How can we get it out? What kinds of strategies could we, you know, because the kind of signing petition things is not working, and we really need to address the issues where they land. Like, what are the information that our members of parliament are giving to us, and how do we address that? How do we address that in a meaningful way to force them to act legitimately, to answer really good questions legitimately? So,
we have 2 more hands up, Jennifer. So
okay.
if you,
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, if
All
you're
right,
okay,
yeah.
if you're okay for time, may we absolutely call it a wrap at 8:30. And Omri, I think you had your hand up first, and then Bill.
Oh, okay. Thanks for taking the second question. I guess, yeah, I would slightly push back on the this is not a political issue, because I think the main reason action hasn't been taken place is because most people need to work for a living, and it's become a lot harder to do that in this era of financialization of all the things that are essential to life. And so I think, as Stephen Colbert would say, is the truth has a well-known left-wing bias. But I guess I'll just leave that at that. And I think the other thing that your presentation made me think of is just having multiple tiers for different people in different places. So it's obvious that there are people in power or positions of power who, for whatever reason, have been able to bury their heads in the sand. And I feel like there's that type of audience where there might need to be a bit more of a sophisticated approach that maybe is just word for word what you gave to us. And then I think there's another one which is more for folks who are involved or willing to take sacrifices, but don't have time to go into everything. And that might be more of what you're talking about, the talking points thing. And then I guess third, there would be just like a general, propaganda campaign where it's just really simple messaging that says what everyone already kind of knows. Like everyone who's a millennial kind of knows that Trudeau is a two-face, and that they're going to capture carbon in the way that they think they can. It's from a Marvel movie. Yeah. So I don't know, things like that. And I'm sure we all know there's other organizations working on it, but I think your research is really valuable. And I just wanted to end by saying that.
Thank you very much. That's really helpful, actually. Yeah, so much appreciated. Thank you. Bill?
Let's see. Right. Well, I thank Roger for the list of catastrophes. The problem is that the science of the climate crisis is fairly straightforward, and there are figures and facts and so on. And skepticalscience.com does a very good job of about 200 different questions and ways of replying to that. But that's no longer the problem. The problem is delayism, first of all, and all the fudging of numbers to say that we have more time. And the problem underneath that is the fact that we had 740 deaths in the heat dome. There were 619 in direct heat dome deaths. We had 740 total of excess death. It had no impact whatsoever on BC's policies, as far as I can tell, except for they may have an alarm now so that we continue to frack, we continue to build LNG, continue to expand LNG, which we know is extremely devastating for the climate. And so the question is, how do you, I think Horgan said famously, fatalities are a part of life. So when you get 740 people in British Columbia who die, the political class looks at the public and the public doesn't react, and therefore they shrug their shoulders and continue on with the infrastructure, the fossil fuel infrastructure. So the question is really, what would it tell? Is there any way to paint the picture of what's coming down the line? I mean, we go through the litany of things that can happen, but there's no science saying those things will happen. And so we're kind of stuck.
Yeah.
Change the minds of people.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. Thank you for I know you were an arrestee who also went to jail. So
As you were.
Yeah, well, I just did community service. David
Okay,
was
good for you.
Yeah, but no, it's a tricky situation, and I run into this all the time. Like I just actually yesterday was with BC Nature, and I was saying, we could talking about getting a grant for doing some work. And I said we could get all of the naturalists in BC that are part of BC Nature to tell us what they're seeing in their ecosystems. That's, I don't know if you saw the story about the birds in the birdhouses that cooked during the heat dome last year. No, a horrible story, and really they're horrifying stories, but that get those stories out to people, and we can figure out how to deal with our grief and turn it into action. And everyone was like, no, you have to give like how to make it better, how to give hope, and I'm kind of, and I'm sort of, and then when we're trying to get a car-free street in this city, and we met with environmental groups, they're like, oh, no, we still need our car. So it's almost like we are, I actually talked to on some UBC climate webinar, and I said, I think all the changes we need to make are positive. I want to live in an environment where we garden and close by in our yards or communities, that we get rid of cars or make it car light. All these walkable communities, they're all healthier, happier communities, but I can't seem to get our communities to move that way. And he said, we are addicted to the status quo, almost like an alcoholic. Our brains are wired to the status quo, and we just can't kind of move off that. But that's where, if we can get rid of the fossil advertising, if we can push our cities, so you can start with our cities, you don't get lobbied like federal governments do, and get them to start to make movements we just passed the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty in a whole bunch of Metro Vancouver communities. It was just passed in London, England yesterday. So you're getting all these cities. Hawaii passed it as a state. So you're getting jurisdictions that can make commitments to moving away from fossil fuels, do that. And then you can use that to get gas out of new builds and houses in municipalities. Fortis is fighting like hell against that, but start these little battles, and then you start thinking about, hey, we should all get heat pumps. Why aren't we getting a heat pump? And now it becomes the norm. So you rewire people to think, why do I have a gas stove? This is giving, this is harming our children. The people who researched that went home and ripped them out because they found out the research was so bad on health stuff. So you start to change the story by looking at what solutions could be, start with the small things and move from there. I really don't know what the answers are. I'm very frustrated by how even environmental groups, et cetera, are reluctant to face it's hard to face the truth of where we're going and the reality of what the changes need to be, even though the changes I think are super good.
Yeah, there's a complete capsize of our values, and that's a problem. I mean, obviously this is hard to deal with, the fact that a nice car is not what you want. You don't want any car at all. So that's very tough to change people's minds. Yeah. Thank you very much. This was very interesting.
Well, thank you very much for coming. Okay, so the environmental committee study on the emissions reduction plan. I don't know any more than you do. If you just Google environment committee, you'll see that all the committee work that they're doing. The emissions reduction plan study is there, and they say we don't have any scheduled hearings at the moment. I don't know if they meet during the summer. I suspect they do not. But I was going to email their person tomorrow and find out when they plan on having the hearings and if they have a deadline, say, for submissions, which they won't have yet, but kind of get an idea of when they meet. So I can let the group know that when I hear back from them. But definitely, you know, you could go back and all those hearings I told you about, they're all online. You can go back and listen to any of it that you want. It's really quite amazing to see what's going on at the MP level and who they get as witnesses and how they question them and all that kind of stuff. We have a blog, yes. So the Gooder Nathan site, so that has a link to the video I did with Climate Reality. It has the link to the emissions reduction plan issues we have. It has a link to David's presentation in front of the Environment Committee on the fossil fuel subsidies. Lots of fantastic information on there. Now you have to kind of put your feet up, make a cup of tea, take your time to go through it. You know, they're not short and they're not easy to read, but I hope you will, like especially the emissions reduction plan, read through it and you will find that it's the details and the quantitative stuff is actually quite gripping. And if you give yourself the time and the space to read through it, you will come out a different person because it's, like I've said tonight, it's really quite profound how we pretend we have a climate plan, but it is really all a cover for increasing production. So.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for offering to do this, for coming to the Protect the Planet Action Team meetings. And contributing in that way as well. It's just so greatly appreciated. And in relation to that, the last action team meeting, we were talking about what we could do going forward, and kind of the some of the biggest ideas were talking about an educational series in some way. Dealing with the politicians was the other one. Art projects and a Hug 2.0. And I really think that the things that that you've presented here and those ideas all can work hand in hand in a way that's going to reach kind of the levels that Omri was talking about, from the politicians to, you know, the people that kind of already know, and the ones that, you know, are distracted maybe by their video games. And trying to get everybody to understand what the stakes are and what the realities are. And to bring both the reality and the hope, because you can't leave the hope out of it, because you will lose a lot of folks. So, but yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for being here and for listening and asking such worthwhile questions. And I will also take back this presentation and the request that David proposed about. I didn't totally write it down, but I'm hoping Bill and Kate, who are also on the coordinating committee, heard that request, and we will bring it to everybody about the public inquiry, about demanding a public inquiry, that we will take that back and cycle back to you about how we can all work together on that.
Fantastic.
So, yes.
Well, thank you so much for hosting and everyone taking your time and coming tonight. Very much appreciated. Thank you so much.
Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you all. Great
Thanks.
presentation, Jennifer.
Thank
Nice
you,
to
Roger.
see
Good to
you.
see you again.
Bye now.
Thanks, everyone.